This is a reading from the Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis. Chapter 14, on avoiding rash judgments. Judge yourself, and beware of passing judgment on others. In judging others, we expend our energy to no purpose. We are often mistaken and easily sin. But if we judge ourselves, our labor is always to our profit. Our judgment is frequently influenced by our personal feelings. It is very easy to fail in right judgment when we are inspired by private motives. Were God Himself the sole and constant object of our desire, we should not be so easily distressed when our opinions are contradicted. Very often some inner impulse or outward circumstance draws us to follow it, while many people are always acting in their own interest, although they are not conscious of it. Such appear to enjoy complete tranquility of mind so long as events accord with their wishes, but at once become distressed and disconsolate when things fall out otherwise. Similarly, differences of opinions and beliefs only too often give rise to quarrels among friends and neighbors, and even between religious and devout people. Old habits are hard to break, and no one is easily weaned from his own opinions. But if you rely on your own reasoning and ability rather than on the virtue of submission to Jesus Christ, Phil, chapter 3, verse 21. I don't know if it's Philippians or Philemon. It's Phil. But if you rely on your own reasoning and ability rather than on the virtue of submission to Jesus Christ, you will but seldom and slowly attain wisdom. For God wills that we become perfectly obedient to Himself, and that we transcend mere reason on the wings of a burning love for Him. Chapter 15, on deeds inspired by love. No motive, even that of affection for anyone, can justify the doing of evil. But to help someone in need, a good work may sometimes be left, or a better undertaken in its place. For in so doing, the good work is not lost, but changed for what is better. Without love, the outward work is of no value, but whatever is done out of love, be it never so little, is wholly fruitful. For God regards the greatness of the love that prompts a man, rather than the greatness of his achievement. Whoever loves much, does much. Whoever does a thing well, does much. And he does well who serves the community before his own interests. Often an apparently loving action really springs from worldly motives, for natural inclination, self-will, hope of reward, and our own self-interest will seldom be entirely absent. Whoever is moved by true and perfect love is never self-seeking, but desires only that God's glory may be served in all things. He envies none, for he seeks no pleasure for himself, nor does he act for self-gratification, but desires above all good things to merit the blessing of God. All good he ascribes not to men, but to God, for whom all things proceed as from their source, and in whom all the saints enjoy perfection and peace. Oh, if only a man had a spark of true love in his heart, he would know for certain that all earthly things are full of vanity. Chapter 16, on bearing with the faults of others. Whatever a man is unable to correct in himself or in others, he should bear patiently until God ordains otherwise. Consider it is perhaps better thus for the testing of our patience, without which our merits are of little worth. Whenever such obstacles confront you, pray to God that He may grant you His help and give you grace to endure them in good heart. Matthew chapter 6, verse 13. If anyone who has been once or twice warned remains obdurate, do not argue with him, but commit all things to God, that His will may be done and His name hallowed in all His servants. For He knows well how to bring good out of evil. Genesis chapter 1, verse 20. Strive to be patient. Bear with the faults and frailties of others, for you too have many faults, which others have to bear. If you cannot mold yourself as you would wish, how can you expect other people to be entirely to your liking? For we require other people to be perfect, but do not correct our own faults. We wish to see others severely reprimanded, yet we are unwilling to be corrected ourselves. We wish to restrict the liberty of others, but are not willing to be denied anything ourselves. We wish others to be bound by rules, yet we will not let ourselves be bound. It is amply evident, therefore, that we seldom consider our neighbor in the same light as ourselves. Yet if all men were perfect, what should we have to bear with in others for Christ's sake? Now, God has thus ordered things that we may learn to bear one another's burdens. Galatians chapter 6, verse 2. For there is no man without his faults, none without his burden. Galatians chapter 6, verse 5. None is sufficient in himself. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 5. None is wise in himself. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 7. Therefore we must support one another. Colossians chapter 3, verse 13. Comfort. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 2. Help, teach, and advise one another. Times of trouble best discover the true worth of a man. They do not weaken him, but show his true nature. Chapter 17. On the monastic life. If you wish to live in peace and harmony with others, you must learn to discipline yourself in many ways. It is not easy to live in a religious community and remain there without fault. Phil, chapter 3, verse 6. Persevering faithfully until death. Revelations, chapter 2, verse 10. Blessed is he who has thus lived happily and well to the end. If you wish to achieve stability and grow in grace, remember always that you are an exile and pilgrim on this earth. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 2, and Hebrews chapter 11, verse 13. Be content to be accounted a fool for Christ's sake. 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 10, if you wish to be a religious. The habit and tonsure by themselves are of small significance. It is the transformation of one's life and the complete mortification of the passions that make a true religious. He who seeks in this life anything but God alone and the salvation of his soul will find nothing but trouble and grief. Ecclesiasticus chapter 1, verse 17, and Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 18. Nor can any remain long at peace who does not strive to be the least. Luke chapter 22, verse 26, and servant of all. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13. You have come here to serve, not to rule. Remember that you are called to labor and endurance, not to pass your time in idleness and gossip. For in this life men are tried like gold in the furnace. Wisdom chapter 3, verse 6. No one can remain here unless he is ready to humble himself with all his heart for love of God. Chapter 18. On the examples of the Holy Fathers. Consider the glowing examples of the Holy Fathers, in whom shone true religion and perfection. Compared with them, we do little or nothing. Alas, how can our life be compared with theirs? The saints and friends of Christ served our Lord in hunger and thirst, in cold and nakedness, in toil and weariness, in watching and fasting, in prayer and meditation, in persecutions and insults without number. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 38, and 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 11. How countless and constant were the trials endured by the apostles, martyrs, confessors, virgins, and all those others who strove to follow in the footsteps of Christ. These all hated their lives in this world, that they might keep them to life eternal. John chapter 12, verse 25. How strict and self-denying was the life of the Holy Fathers in the desert. How long and grievous the temptations they endured. How often they were assaulted by the devil. How frequent and fervent their prayers to God. How strict their fasts. How great their zeal and ardor for spiritual progress. How valiant the battles they fought to overcome their vices. How pure and upright their intention towards God. All day long they labored, and the night they gave to continuous prayer. Even as they worked, they never ceased from mental prayer. They spent all their time with profit, every hour seeming short in the service of God. They often forgot even their bodily needs in the great sweetness of contemplation. They renounced all riches, dignities, honors, friends, and kindred. They desired to possess nothing in this world. Scarcely would they take the necessities of life, and only with reluctance would they provide for the needs of the body. Thus, though destitute of earthly goods, they were abundantly rich in grace and all virtues. Outwardly they were poor, but inwardly they were refreshed with grace and heavenly consolation. They were strangers to the world, but to God they were dear and familiar friends. Exodus chapter 33, verse 2. To themselves they were nothing, but in the eyes of God they were precious and beloved. Grounded in true humility, they lived in simple obedience. They walked in charity and patience, Ephesians chapter 5, verse 2, and thus daily increased in the Spirit, and received great grace from God. They were given for an example to all religious, and they should encourage us to advance in holiness, rather than the lukewarm should incline us to laxness. How deep was the fervor of all religious at the foundation of their order! How great was their devotion in prayer and their zeal for virtue! How strict was their observance of the rule! What respect and obedience to the direction of the superior flourished in those days! Their examples still witness that they were indeed holy and perfect men, who fought valiantly and trampled the world under their feet. But in these days, and who is not a breaker of rules, or who obeys with patience, is accounted outstanding. Oh, the carelessness and coldness of this present time! Sloth and lukewarmness make life wearisome for us, and we soon lose our early fervor. May the longing to grow in grace not remain dormant in you, who have been privileged to witness so many examples of the holy life.